everybody, this is Michelle Fox and welcome back to The Simple Quilter. Are you a beginner quilter? Are you trying to decide what kind of quilt to make, what pattern to select? Well, this is the program for you because today I'm going to be talking about what to look for when you're looking for a beginner quilt pattern, and I'm going to be showing you some examples of some great beginner quilts. Now, the first thing you want to think about is the size of project. Now, I think if you're a beginner, you need to start with something small so you'll have some success and you won't feel so defeated trying to tackle a huge project. Now, behind me, I have a couple of great examples. This is just a table runner using a charm pack. It's going to be an easy project to do, as well as you can use a charm pack that you can get for probably under $11. Now, if you find them on sale, you might be able to find them a little bit cheaper, but that would make a great beginner quilt project. And it's small enough so that you can even quilt it on your own. Now, another good size of quilt to make is a baby size quilt. They're small enough so that it's just not tons and tons of work. So the first thing you need to consider is what size of quilt you want to make. And I suggest you go small for your first quilt. The next thing you want to think about with your quilt is the block size. Now on this quilt, this is using a charm pack. And these blocks are pretty small. So if you were wanting to make a larger quilt, I wouldn't recommend using a 5-inch square. I would use a larger square like in this ragtime quilt. So when you're looking at quilt patterns for beginners, I would also recommend that you look at a quilt that has fewer blocks. The next thing I think you should consider is matching seams. How many matching seams are you going to have to match up? Because that is difficult for beginners. Now, the ragtime quilt, you do kind of have to match them up, but this is one of the most forgiving quilts that you can ever make. So that's not so important on choosing this. So this makes a great quilt because even though you have to match the seams a little bit, the pattern's forgiving and it's not going to matter if you're off a little bit. Now this one you do have to match up a little bit, but it's not the most difficult. Those aren't the most difficult seams to match up. So the three things are the size of the quilt pattern, the size of the block, the number of seams you're going to have to match up, and you also need to be looking at how many pieces per block. Like in this, you only have one piece per block. And in this one, you only have one piece per block. One time I took a class, I can't remember what the workshop was called. Bought all the fabric, went to the workshop, attended the workshop. I ended up giving that quilt away. It had 49 pieces per block. That is just not that's just not the kind of quilt I want to be making. So be sure you're not choosing a super difficult block to make. And again, the fewer pieces to the block, the better for the beginner quilter. Now, one of the easiest quilts to make is the simple patchwork quilt like those up on my design wall behind me. They're just blocks set in next to each other and sewn together. Now, if you wanted to make a larger quilt, I think just doing a simple patchwork quilt like that would be great. But I personally would use a cake layer. And let me show you an example of a cake layer that I would like to use to make a beginner quilt. Okay, so the first quilt that we were talking about was the patchwork quilt, and that is where you're just taking blocks and you're sewing them together. Again, this is a charm pack that I used to make this. One charm pack actually made two of these, and I just sewed these together. Now you can do this in a larger size and use a cake layer. So a cake layer typically has 42 pieces, and you can take, this is a really neat one. This is called Peacemakers, and it's a quilting theme, but it's got these really neat fabrics. And what you could do, like on this one, I could sew all these together, just like I did this, and make a 6 by 7, do 6 rows across, 7 rows, 6 rows across, 7 rows down for your quilt. That's going to make a pretty nice quilt. Then you could take a light cream for an accent border, and I have this little bit of yardage, and I could just do a larger border around that. Now that would make a super cute, easy beginner quilt. And you can do that with any cake layer. Look at this one. This was called Alpine Woods by Benartex. Oh my goodness, I have all kinds of dark colors that I could use as a border. I could use a light cream for a little accent border. That would make one that our family would like, since we like to camp, fish, and my husband and son like to hunt. And look at this one. This is called Liberty Gatherings. And this would make a super cute 4th of July quilt. You could, do a red accent border or a navy blue. I have lots of these colors. And that would make a super, super easy beginner quilt. So again, one of the easiest beginner quilts is a simple patchwork quilt done with charm squares to make a table runner, or a cake layer to make a larger quilt. Now, I would not recommend using 5-inch squares to make a big quilt as a beginner quilt. That's a lot of pieces to sew together, and you really do want your project to be easy to do, you want to be able to finish it fairly quickly so you don't lose interest, and you want it to look beautiful. And that's just a great way to use those stacks of cake layers that you may have in your quilt room. And if you don't have one, it's an easy way to get a large variety of fabrics for your quilt so that you're not having to buy lots of yardage. Now, the ragtime quilts are one of my all-time favorite go-to quilts, and the reason these make great beginner quilts is because, like I said earlier, they're very forgiving. You only have to sew an X on the block to quilt it, and then you don't even have to pay a quilter to finish it, and you have a quick, easy project that you didn't have to invest a lot of money in to get quilted. So the ragtime quilt is also a great, great, great beginner quilt. It's one of my go-to quilts. I've made lots and lots of those. The next quilt pattern that I want to talk about that makes a great beginner quilt pattern is Turning 20. Now, I have to say it's not my favorite, but it was a good quilt when I was first learning how to quilt, because you don't have just tons and tons of seams to match up. And you could use several fat quarters. My daughter loved brights. She loves this quilt. Again, it's not my favorite pattern, but she loves all these bright colors. And it went together quick and easy. So this makes a good quilt pattern to use. Now, I will put a link to these quilt patterns in the description below. So I'll put some links down below for the patterns that I'm showing you. But again, the Turning 20, and there are several variations to the Turning 20 pattern. There's several that have come out since then, but this is an all-time old favorite. You'll see this quilt made a lot. Another quilt that is a great beginner quilt is a quilt using a panel, because you don't have to do a lot of sewing. Now, this is a project that I showed how to do in my panel quilt series, and this is just one solid panel here, and then I've just pieced the border. So consider making a panel quilt, especially if you're needing a baby quilt. I'll put up a picture of a baby quilt that I just recently finished, And it was super, super easy. I just used the panel and some 5-inch squares going around the outside. I sent that to my sister for their new grandbaby, and she just loved it. It really did turn out to be a great quilt, but I'll put a picture up of that. So if you're needing a baby quilt, it's a nice size for a beginner, and those panel quilts, all you have to do is add a border, the binding, and quilt it. You can even pay to have it quilted if you'd like. Okay, another great beginner quilt is the string quilt. Now this is a string quilt that I made using the foundation squares, 10-inch foundation squares. Now it does get a little bit harder because I added sashing and a cornerstone, but that's still a pretty easy beginner quilt to do. So if you're a beginner and want a little bit more of a challenge, you might consider doing a string quilt. Now I have shown how to do these string blocks, and if you're interested in that, I'll put a link up above for those. And I purchased the 10-inch foundation pieces at Missouri Star Quilt Company and the Fat Quarter Shop. Alright, now the quilt behind me is my Route 66 quilt. I've shown it before, but this is a 3-yard quilt, and there are several books called 3-yard quilts, and all of them make great beginner quilts. And you have large blocks, very large blocks. You don't have any matching seams, well, maybe a couple in the corner, and the size isn't that big. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, please share with a friend, and as always, leave a comment. I love to get the comments and try to reply to each and every one. So until next time, have fun quilting.